In a quiet village, nestled between two hills, where morning mist clung to the valleys and time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world, there lived a boy named Azuka. At 19 years old, his life had already been marked by more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. Azuka's dark skin glistened with sweat even before the sun fully rose each morning. This wasn't the glow of youth and vitality, but the evidence of grueling labor that began before dawn and ended long after sunset. Fetching water from the distant stream, sweeping the entire compound, chopping firewood, cooking, tending to animals, these tasks filled his days with relentless toil. His hands, calloused and weathered beyond his years, told the story of a childhood stolen by tragedy. When Azuka was just 11 years old, a terrible fire had consumed his family's home, taking both his parents with it. The flames didn't just destroy his house, they destroyed his childhood, his security, and the warm embrace of parental love. With nowhere else to turn, young Azuka had been taken in by his uncle Bellucci, Aunt Maka, and their two daughters, Odi and Chikodi. But from the very first day, it was clear that Azuka wasn't being welcomed as family. He was a burden, an obligation, a free source of labor. Uncle Bellucci's household didn't treat him as a nephew who had lost everything. They treated him as a servant, someone whose grief and loss were inconveniences rather than tragedies deserving of compassion. "Azuka!" Aunt Maka's voice would pierce the morning air like a blade. "Why is the compound not swept yet? Are you planning to be lazy all your life?" This particular morning, it was barely 5:30. Azuka had already made 3 trips to the stream, his shoulders aching from the weight of the water buckets. But defending himself was pointless. He had learned that lesson painfully over the years. Silence was survival. Any word of protest would only bring harsher punishment, more impossible tasks, and the withholding of even the meager portions of food he was given. "Look at this useless boy," Odi would sneer from the doorway, her arms crossed in contempt as she watched him work. "What woman would ever want to marry someone so worthless? He can't even carry water without struggling." Chikodi, never one to miss an opportunity to join in the mockery, laughed cruelly beside her sister. "We should find him a wife from the refuse dump, someone as worthless as he is. They'd make a perfect match." The words cut deep, but Azuka's face remained carefully blank. Over the years, he had built walls around his heart, protecting the fragile sense of self-worth that still flickered within him like a candle in the wind. He set down the buckets with deliberate care, ignored the sisters completely, and continued with his endless list of chores. What Uncle Bellucci's family failed to see, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that despite their cruelty, Azuka had grown into a young man of remarkable character. His respectful nature, his willingness to help neighbors without expecting anything in return, his gentle manner and quiet dignity had made him well liked throughout the village. More than once, families with eligible daughters had approached Uncle Bellucci, seeing in Azuka the qualities of a good husband, hardworking, kind, responsible. Each time, Uncle Bellucci had waved them away dismissively. "That boy, he has nothing. No dowry, no property, no prospects. Any family that takes him would be doing charity work, not making a marriage." But the real reason, the one Uncle Bellucci would never speak aloud, was simpler and more selfish. Azuka was free labor. A married Azuka would leave the household, and Uncle Bellucci had no intention of losing his unpaid worker. Then, everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she appeared, a young woman walking into the compound with a noticeable limp, her clothes dusty from travel. She looked poor, perhaps even poorer than Azuka himself. Her wrapper was faded and patched in places, her blouse had seen better days, and her sandals were worn thin. A simple headscarf covered her hair, and she carried a small cloth bag that looked nearly empty. Her name was Oluchi. Uncle Bellucci, who had been sitting under the mango tree avoiding the afternoon heat, looked up with interest. Not because he saw anything appealing about this stranger, but because he saw an opportunity. "Good afternoon, sir." Oluchi greeted him respectfully, her voice soft but clear. "Afternoon," Uncle Bellucci responded, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. "What brings you to my compound?" "I heard you have a nephew of marriageable age. I've come to see if we might make a match." Aunt Maka, who had been eavesdropping from inside the house, came rushing out, her face lit up with malicious glee. A poor, crippled girl wanting to marry Azuka. This was too perfect. "Oh, yes, yes," Aunt Maka said, barely containing her excitement. "Our nephew, Azuka, he's available." The way she said available made it sound like a burden she was desperate to offload. Uncle Bellucci caught on immediately to his wife's thinking. Here was a chance to get rid of Azuka in the most humiliating way possible. They would marry him off to this poor, crippled stranger, and the whole village would laugh at him, and perhaps, if they were lucky, the shame would keep Azuka from ever asking them for anything again. "Let me call him," Uncle Bellucci said, a cruel smile playing at his lips. Azuka was behind the house repairing a broken fence when he heard his name being called. He walked around to the front compound, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands dirty from work. When he saw the young woman standing there, his first thought was confusion, quickly followed by a sinking feeling of dread. He knew that look in his uncle's eyes. "Azuka," Uncle Bellucci announced with mock formality. "This is Oluchi. She has come seeking marriage. I have agreed. The wedding will be in 1 week." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Azuka stared at his uncle, then at the stranger named Oluchi. 1 week? He was being married off to someone he'd never met, given no choice, no discussion, just a pronouncement, as if he were property to be disposed of. Odi and Chikodi, who had emerged from the house to witness this spectacle, burst into laughter. "Brother Azuka is marrying a crippled beggar," Odi cackled. "How fitting!" "Both of them poor as church rats," Chikodi added, holding her sides. "They can beg for food together." Aunt Maka's smile was vicious with satisfaction. "Finally, you'll be someone else's burden, Azuka, though I pity the poor girl who's taking you." Azuka looked at Oluchi again, really looked at her this time. Her face she stood quietly, her face calm despite the mockery filling the air. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Not romance, not attraction, but a mutual understanding of suffering, of being unwanted, of being treated as less than human. She gave him the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and in that gesture, Azuka sensed something he couldn't quite name. Dignity, perhaps, or strength hidden beneath the appearance of weakness. "I accept," Azuka heard himself say, surprising even himself. What did it matter anymore? His life here was barely a life at all. Perhaps this stranger, poor and crippled as she was, would at least treat him like a human being. That alone would be an improvement. Uncle Bellucci clapped his hands together. "Excellent! 1 week then. Azuka, you'll continue your duties until then, and don't expect any help with wedding preparations. You are lucky we are allowing you to marry at all."
As Oluchi turned to leave, she paused beside Azuka. "I'll return in 3 days," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "We should talk before the wedding." Then she was gone, limping back down the path she'd come from, leaving Azuka standing in the compound, while his uncle and aunt already started planning how they would humiliate him at the wedding. That night, as Azuka lay on his thin mat in the cramped space where he slept, he thought about the strange woman who had appeared so suddenly in his life. Who was she? Why had she come seeking marriage with him, of all people? What kind of life awaited him after this forced wedding? The question swirled in his mind, but underneath them all was one persistent thought. Anything had to be better than this. 3 days later, Oluchi returned as promised. She found Azuka at the stream, filling water buckets in the early morning. "Can we talk?" she asked, and Azuka nodded, setting down his buckets. They sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, far enough from the village that no one would overhear them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Oluchi turned to him, her expression serious. I want you to know that I will not force you into anything you don't want. This marriage, I understand it wasn't your choice. It wasn't really mine either, in a way. Azuka looked at her, puzzled. Then why did you come? Oluchi was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I was looking for someone with a good heart, someone who has suffered but hasn't let it make them cruel. You don't know anything about me, Azuka said softly. I know more than you think, Oluchi replied. I've been watching this village for weeks. I've seen how you help the widow Mamankiru carry her firewood even when you're exhausted from your own work. I've seen you share the little food you have with the street children. I've heard how you speak, always respectful, always kind, even to those who treat you terribly. Azuka felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he hadn't even known he'd built. When was the last time someone had noticed his kindness? When had anyone seen him as anything other than a burden or a servant? I'm very poor, he needed her to understand. I have nothing to give you. No house, no land, no money. Uncle Bellucci won't give me a single kobo for dowry or to start a life. Oluchi smiled, a strange, knowing smile that made Azuka feel like she was keeping a secret. What if I told you that what you have is worth more than any amount of money? I'd say you are either very kind or very foolish, Azuka replied honestly. Perhaps a bit of both, Oluchi admitted. But I mean it. Your character, your heart, that's what I'm choosing. The rest, she trailed off, her smile widening slightly. The rest will take care of itself. There was something in her eyes, a depth that seemed at odds with her shabby clothes and humble appearance. But before Azuka could question it further, she stood up. I should go before your aunt comes looking for you. But Azuka, I want you to know that after we are married, you will never be treated as a servant again. You'll never go hungry. You'll never be mocked or belittled. I promise you that. How can you promise that when we'll both be poor? Azuka asked. Oluchi's smile turned mysterious. Trust me, she said simply. Just a little while longer, and everything will make sense. Then she was gone again, leaving Azuka more confused than ever, but also, for the first time in years, feeling a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The remaining days until the wedding passed in a blur of continued abuse and mockery. Aunt Maka gave Azuka the worst chores imaginable, seeming to relish every moment of his suffering before he would escape into what she assumed would be an even worse life. You'll regret leaving this house, she told him venomously. At least here you had food and shelter. That crippled girl probably lives in a mud hut. You'll starve together. Odi and Chikodi spread the news throughout the village with gleeful malice. Poor Azuka is marrying an even poorer girl, both of them worthless. But what surprised them all was that the village didn't share their mockery. Instead, many people expressed sympathy for Azuka and quiet admiration that he was accepting his fate with such dignity. Some even seemed puzzled about the girl, saying they had asked around but no one seemed to know where she was from. The wedding day arrived with all the joy of a funeral. There was no celebration, no music, no feast. Uncle Bellucci had arranged for the bare minimum, a brief ceremony with the village elder to make it official and nothing more. Azuka wore the same clothes he wore every day, washed clean but still showing their age and wear. He had no money for wedding attire, and his uncle had certainly not provided any. When Oluchi arrived, she was dressed simply as well, though Azuka noticed her clothes looked slightly newer than what she'd worn before. Still poor by any standard, but clean and neat. The ceremony was perfunctory and brief. The village elder, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the joyless proceedings, recited the traditional words. Azuka and Oluchi spoke their vows, simple promises to respect and care for each other. Throughout it all, Uncle Bellucci, Aunt Maka, Odi, and Chikodi wore expressions of barely suppressed glee, as if they just won a great victory. They were finally rid of their burden, and in the most humiliating way possible. But then, something unexpected happened. As the brief ceremony concluded and Azuka turned to face his new wife with a mix of resignation and uncertainty, Oluchi took his hand gently. "Come with me," she said softly. "I have something to show you." She led him away from the compound, down the village path. Uncle Bellucci called after them mockingly, "Don't forget to send word when you need food, though we probably won't have any to spare." But Oluchi kept walking, Azuka beside her, confused about where they were going. They walked past the market, past the village square, toward the main road. And there, parked under the shade of a large mango tree, was a gleaming black SUV with a uniformed driver standing beside it. Azuka stopped walking, his heart pounding. "Oluchi, what?" The driver opened the back door with a respectful bow. "Welcome, madame, sir." Oluchi turned to Azuka, and for the first time he saw her fully smile, not the small, careful smile she'd shown before, but a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "Get in," she said gently. "We have a lot to talk about." Azuka's mind was reeling. The SUV, the driver, the way the man had called Oluchi Madame with such reference, none of it made sense. In a daze, he climbed into the vehicle, its leather seats and air conditioning, a shocking contrast to anything he'd ever experienced.
"I don't know how to be a husband to someone like you," Azuka admitted. "I don't know how to navigate this world. I barely know how to read and write properly. My uncle stopped me from going to school after primary level." "Then I'll teach you," Oluchi said immediately. "We'll hire tutors. You can continue your education, learn anything you want. But Azuka, I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to be exactly who you've always been. A good, kind, honest person. That's what I want in a partner." Azuka was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Everything had changed so fast. This morning, he'd woken up as a servant in his uncle's house, resigned to a life of poverty with a stranger. Now he was sitting in a mansion, married to a wealthy woman who claimed she'd chosen him for his character. "I want to go back," Azuka said finally. Oluchi's face fell. "You want to leave?" "No," Azuka clarified. "I want to go back to the village. I want them to see. I want Uncle Bellucci and Aunt Maka and Odi and Chikodi to know that I wasn't worthless, that they were wrong about me." Understanding dawned on Oluchi's face, followed by a slow smile. "You want closure. I want them to know that all their cruelty, all their mockery, all their attempts to break me, they failed. I survived. I thrived. Not because of anything they did, but despite everything they did." Oluchi nodded. "Then we'll go back tomorrow, and we'll show them exactly how wrong they were." That night, Azuka slept in a bedroom that was larger than the entire space he'd lived in at his uncle's house. The bed was soft, the sheets were clean and smooth, and for the first time in 8 years, he went to sleep without his body aching from labor, without his stomach empty from meager rations, without his heart heavy with despair. The next morning, after a breakfast more lavish than anything Azuka had ever experienced, they prepared to return to the village. Oluchi had her staff prepare a few items, documents, a small box, and an envelope. "What are those for?" Azuka asked. "You'll see," Oluchi said with a mysterious smile. They took the same black SUV, and as they drove back towards the village, Azuka felt his nervousness growing. Part of him wanted this confrontation, wanted to see the looks on their faces, but another part of him, the part that had been beaten down for so long, was afraid. Afraid they'd find some way to hurt him again, to take this away. Oluchi seemed to sense his anxiety. "Whatever happens, I'm right here beside you. You're not alone anymore, Azuka. You'll never be alone again." When the SUV pulled into the village, people stopped and stared. Expensive vehicles were rare here, and everyone was curious about who it could be. When the driver opened the door and Azuka stepped out, wearing new clothes Oluchi had provided, simple but well-made, fitting him properly, the whispers started immediately. "Is that Azuka? What is he doing in such a car? Whose vehicle is that?" Oluchi stepped out beside him, also dressed more formally now, a beautiful outfit that showed her wealth without being ostentatious. The transformation from the poor, limping girl to this poised, confident woman was striking. They walked towards Uncle Bellucci's compound, and as news spread, people began to gather, following at a distance, curious about what was happening. Uncle Bellucci was in the compound when they arrived, sitting in his usual spot under the mango tree. When he saw them, his expression went from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like fear. Aunt Maka rushed out of the house, with Odi and Chikodi close behind. All three women froze when they saw the expensive vehicle and the transformed couple. What is this?" Uncle Bellucci stammered as he stood up. Oluchi stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying authority. "My name is Oluchi Nwaku, daughter of the late Eze Nwaku. I believe you remember him." The color drained from Uncle Bellucci's face. Behind him, Aunt Maka gasped. "I came to this village seeking information about my father's death, and I found something I wasn't expecting. A young man you treated as worthless, as a burden, as something less than human. A young man who, despite all your cruelty, remained kind and good." She gestured to Azuka, who stood beside her, his back straight, his head high. "This is my husband, not because I pitied him or because he was convenient, but because in him I found something rare and precious, a good heart, something you lack entirely." Uncle Bellucci tried to speak, but Oluchi held up her hand. "I am not finished. You defrauded my father. You took his money through false pretenses, destroyed his reputation, and contributed to his death. I have all the evidence, all the documents proving what you did." She pulled out a folder from the bag she carried. "I could take you to court. I could destroy you financially and socially. I could make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." Uncle Bellucci was shaking now, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "But I'm not going to do that," Oluchi said, and confusion crossed Uncle Bellucci's face. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because I've learned that the best revenge is living well. The best revenge is taking someone you treated as worthless and showing the world how wrong you were." She turned to Azuka. "Would you like to say anything?" Azuka looked at his uncle, at his aunt, at his cousins who had mocked him just yesterday. They all looked smaller now, diminished, and he realized something important. They had no power over him anymore. They never really had. They'd had temporary authority over his circumstances, but they'd never been able to touch who he really was. "I forgive you," Azuka said simply. Aunt Maka's face contorted with shock. "Forgive us? You forgive us?" "Yes," Azuka replied calmly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I'm not going to carry your cruelty with me anymore. I'm not going to let what you did define who I am." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope Oluchi had given him that morning. Inside was a substantial amount of money. He handed it to Aunt Maka. "This is for you and your daughters, not because I owe you anything, but because, despite everything, you gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Consider any debt paid in full." Aunt Maka took the envelope with trembling hands, too shocked to speak. Then Oluchi handed Uncle Bellucci the small box she had been carrying. "Inside this box is a document showing that the debt you owe to my father's estate has been settled, not by you, but by your nephew. Azuka paid it on your behalf." Uncle Bellucci opened the box with trembling hands, staring at the official document inside. "The debt is settled," Oluchi repeated, "but you'll have to live with what you did. You'll have to live knowing that the boy you treated as worthless became the man who saved you from financial and legal ruin." Oluchi climbed in beside him, and the driver closed the door before taking his position up front. As the vehicle pulled smoothly onto the road, Azuka finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Oluchi settled back in her seat, her expression becoming serious. "My real name is Oluchi Nwonko," she began. "My father was Eze Nwonko, one of the most successful businessmen in this region, before he died 5 years ago." Azuka's eyes widened. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Eze Nwonko had been famous for his wealth, his business empire, and his philanthropic works. "But you," Azuka looked at her shabby clothes, her worn sandals. "The limp is real," Oluchi said. "A childhood accident. But everything else, the poor clothes, the humble appearance, that was deliberate." "Why?" Azuka asked, struggling to process what he was hearing. Oluchi's expression darkened. "Because of your uncle." And then she told him the whole story. Years ago, Uncle Bellucci had been a business associate of her father's. He had come to Eze Nwonko with a supposedly incredible investment opportunity, prime land that the government was about to develop, guaranteed to multiply in value 10 times over. Eze Nwonko, trusting his associate, had invested heavily, putting in not just his own money, but funds he'd borrowed from other investors, promising them returns. But the land deal was completely fraudulent. The documents were forged, the government development was a lie. Uncle Bellucci had pocketed the money and disappeared, leaving Eze Nwonko to face financial ruin and public disgrace. "My father was a proud man," Oluchi continued, her voice tight with old pain. "The shame of being defrauded, of losing other people's money, of being made a fool, it destroyed him. He had a heart attack within 6 months. He died believing he'd failed everyone he trusted." Azuka felt sick. "I didn't know. I was just a child then, before the fire." "I know you had nothing to do with it," Oluchi said quickly. "After my father died, I took over the business with my mother's help. We rebuilt everything in secret, operating through different company names, keeping out of the public eye. We recovered all the money and more, but I never forgot what your uncle did." "So this is revenge?" Azuka asked, his voice hollow. "You married me to get back at Uncle Bellucci?" "No," Oluchi said firmly, taking his hand. "I married you because I spent weeks watching that household, trying to decide how to proceed. And what I saw broke my heart." She squeezed his hand gently. "I saw how they treated you, how they abused and mocked you, how despite everything, you remained kind and good. I saw you sharing your food with hungry children. I saw you helping elderly neighbors. I saw dignity and goodness in someone who had every reason to be bitter and cruel." "I still don't understand," Azuka said, though his heart was starting to race with an emotion he was afraid to name. "I came to that village looking for answers about my father's death," Oluchi explained. "But what I found was you. And I realized something. The best revenge against someone like Uncle Bellucci isn't to hurt him directly. It's to take the person he treated as worthless and show the world, show him, just how wrong he was." Tears were starting to form in Azuka's eyes. "You married me because you thought I was worth something?" "I married you because I know you are worth something. I married you because when I watched you, I didn't see a poor orphan boy. I saw a good man, someone who's been beaten down by life but never broken, someone whose heart remained pure despite everything." The SUV was now driving through areas Azuka had never seen before. Paved roads, modern buildings, a world far beyond his small village. "Where are we going?" Azuka asked. Oluchi smiled. "Home." 20 minutes later, the SUV turned into a long driveway lined with palm trees. As they drove forward, Azuka's jaw dropped. Before them stood a magnificent mansion, modern architecture blending beautifully with traditional elements, fountains in the courtyard, manicured gardens, and multiple buildings spread across the property. This is where you live?" Azuka breathed. "This is where we live," Oluchi corrected gently. "You're my husband now, Azuka. This is your home too." The vehicle stopped in front of the main house, and immediately several staff members emerged, all greeting Oluchi respectfully. She introduced Azuka simply as her husband, and their reception of him was warm and deferential. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Marble floors, high ceilings, expensive furnishings, air conditioning in every room. Azuka felt like he'd stepped into a dream, or perhaps he had hit his head and this was all a hallucination. Oluchi led him to a spacious sitting room and gestured for him to sit on a plush sofa. A staff member brought them cold drinks immediately. "I know this is overwhelming," Oluchi said, sitting beside him, "and I know you must have 1,000 questions." "Why the limp?" Azuka asked suddenly, remembering that detail. Oluchi's expression softened. "The limp is real, as I said. A car accident when I was 12. It doesn't slow me down much, but it's noticeable. What I did was exaggerated slightly, along with wearing old clothes and acting poor. I needed to blend in, not to draw attention." "And you really chose me?" Azuka asked, still struggling to believe it. "You could have anyone. You are wealthy, you are educated, you are beautiful. Why me?" Oluchi turned to face him fully. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone with a genuinely good heart? Someone who hasn't been corrupted by bitterness or greed or cruelty. I've met plenty of wealthy men, educated men, men who looked perfect on paper, but their hearts were empty or rotten." She reached out and gently touched his cheek. "You, Azuka, you've suffered more than most people will ever. You've been treated like you were worthless for 8 years, and yet you remained kind. You remained good. Do you know how extraordinary that is?" Azuka felt tears spilling down his cheeks now, all the years of pent-up pain and loneliness finally finding release. "I'm not extraordinary. I'm just me." "Exactly," Oluchi said softly. "You are just you, and that's more than enough." She gave him time to cry, to process, to simply feel all the emotions he'd been suppressing for so long. Finally, when he'd calmed down a bit, she spoke again. "I want to be clear about something, Azuka. This marriage, I know it started under false pretenses on my part. You married me thinking I was poor, thinking we'd struggle together. Now you know the truth is very different. If you want to leave, if you want to end this, I'll understand. I'll make sure you are taken care of, give you enough money to start a life anywhere you want. But I hope," her voice became vulnerable, almost pleading, "I hope you'll stay. Not because of the money or the house, but because you choose to." Azukan looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, but also the vulnerability she was showing him now. She had everything, yet she was asking him, a poor orphan boy, to choose her. The gathered villagers were murmuring now, the story spreading in real time. Uncle Bellucci would never live this down. His reputation would never recover from this humiliation, not of being punished, but of being shown mercy by someone he'd abused. Azuka took one last look at the compound where he'd suffered for so long. "I won't be coming back here, but I want you to know that I don't hate you. I pity you, because you had a chance to show love to a child who'd lost everything, and you chose cruelty instead. You'll have to live with that choice." As they turned to leave, Odi suddenly called out, "Wait!" Azuka and Oluchi paused. Odi was crying, her face crumpled with shame. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Brother Azuka. We were cruel to you. We were wrong." Chikodi was crying too now, both sisters looking genuinely remorseful. Azuka looked at them for a long moment, then nodded. "I hope you'll be kinder to others in the future. That's all I ask." As they walked back to the SUV, the villagers pattered to let them through. Some were smiling, some were crying, and many were whispering prayers of thanksgiving. Mama Nkiru, the widow Azuka often helped, called out, "God has vindicated you, my son. God has vindicated you." In the car, as they drove away from the village, Azuka felt something release in his chest. A weight he'd been carrying for 8 years, finally lifting. He wasn't just leaving the village, he was leaving behind the person he'd been forced to be. The servant, the burden, the worthless nephew. He was becoming someone new, Or perhaps he was finally becoming who he'd always been underneath all the pain, a man of worth, of dignity, of value. "How do you feel?" Oluchi asked softly. Azuka thought about it carefully before answering. "I feel free. For the first time in 8 years, I feel free." Oluchi smiled and took his hand. "Good, because this is just the beginning." Over the following weeks and months, Azuka's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Oluchi kept her promise. She arranged for tutors to help him complete his education. Azuka proved to be a quick learner, his mind sharp despite being told he was stupid. Oluchi also brought him into her business, starting with simple tasks, but gradually showing him how the empire her father had built and she had rebuilt actually worked. Azuka had a natural talent for understanding people, for seeing the human side of business transactions, and Oluchi found his insights valuable. But perhaps the most important thing was the project they started together. One day, Oluchi took Azuka to a plot of land she'd purchased in a different part of the region. She said, "I want to build something here, a center for orphan children and vulnerable young people, a place where they can live with dignity, receive education, learn skills, and most importantly, be treated with love and respect." Azuka's eyes filled with tears. "Like what I never had." "Exactly like what you never had," Oluchi confirmed. "I want to call it the Azuka Center for Hope because you are living proof that kindness survives, that good hearts exist, that suffering doesn't have to destroy you." The center became their shared project passion. Azuka, who understood intimately what it felt like to be unwanted and abused, had insights that no expert consultant could provide. He knew what these children needed because he had needed it himself. The center opened a year after their marriage, and it was nothing short of magnificent. Comfortable dormitories, a full school facility, vocational training workshops, gardens where children could learn farming, a sports complex, and most importantly, staff who were carefully screened and trained to provide emotional support and genuine care. At the opening ceremony, Azuka gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "I stand before you today not because I'm special, but because I survived. I survived being treated as worthless. I survived being told I would amount to nothing. I survived being denied education, love, and basic dignity." He paused, looking out at the crowd, dignitaries, journalists, community leaders, and most importantly, the first group of children who would live at the center. "But surviving isn't enough. What I want for every child who comes through these doors is not just survival, but thriving. I want them to know they have worth not because of what they own or where they come from, but because they exist, because they are human beings deserving of love and respect." He glanced at Oluchi, who stood beside him with pride shining in her eyes. "I was blessed to meet someone who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself, someone who looked past my circumstances and saw my heart. Not every orphan will be that lucky, but every orphan who comes here will know they are valued. They will know they are loved. They will know they have a future." The applause was thunderous, and as Azuka cut the ribbon to officially open the Azuka Center for Hope, he thought about that scared 11-year-old boy who had lost everything in a fire. He thought about the teenager who had endured years of abuse and mockery. And he thought about the 19-year-old who was forced to marry a stranger, having no idea that stranger would change his entire life. News of the center spread quickly, and with it, Azuka's story. Journalists wanted to interview him, magazines wanted to feature him, but Azuka remained humble, always redirecting attention to the work being done and the children being helped. Meanwhile, back in the village, Uncle Bellucci's household had fallen on hard times. Not because Azuka or Oluchi had taken revenge, but because the truth had a way of affecting people. Once villagers knew what Uncle Bellucci had done, both the fraud that destroyed Ezenwanko and the abuse of his nephew, people lost respect for him. Business opportunities dried up, social invitations stopped coming. Odi and Chikodi, to their credit, had taken Azuka's forgiveness seriously. They had both sought him out separately, apologizing more thoroughly and asking for his guidance.
Azuka, true to his nature, had helped them find positions at one of Oluchi's companies, giving them a chance to build their own lives away from their parents' shadow. Aunt Maka had written a letter to Azuka, a long, painful letter acknowledging every cruel thing she'd done and said. She didn't ask for forgiveness or help, she simply wanted him to know that she recognized her wrongs and would have to live with that regret. Azuka wrote back, a brief note, assuring her that he held no grudge and hoping she would find peace. Uncle Bellucci never reached out, pride perhaps, or shame too deep to overcome. But through the village grapevine, Azuka heard that his uncle's health had declined, the stress and guilt taking their toll. 2 years after the wedding, Oluchi came to Azuka with news that made his heart race. "I'm pregnant," she said, her eyes shining with joy and just a touch of nervousness. Azuka swept her into her arms, laughing and crying at the same time. A child! They were going to have a child! A child who would grow up knowing love, security, and that their father was once the poorest, most downtrodden orphan boy, but had survived and thrived. Their daughter, when she was born, was named Adaeze, meaning daughter of the king, because Oluchi insisted that Azuka was her king, her hero. And little Adaeze would grow up in a home filled with love, learning from her father's gentle strength and her mother's wise determination. But the story doesn't end there, because Azuka's influence spread far beyond his own family.
The Azuka Center for Hope expanded to multiple locations across Nigeria. Each center followed the same model, treating vulnerable children with dignity, providing education and skills, but most importantly, showing them love and respect. Azuka became a sought-after speaker, traveling to schools and organizations to talk about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of kindness. His message was simple but profound. Your circumstances don't define your worth. How others treat you doesn't determine your value. You are worthy simply because you exist. Young people who heard him speak often came away transformed. Adults who had survived their own abuses found hope in his story. And abusers, some of them at least, were confronted with the consequences of their cruelty. One particular event stood out in Azuka's memory. He had been invited to speak at a university, and after his presentation, a young woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm a housemaid for my relatives," she said quietly. "They treat me like you were treated. Your story, it gave me hope that things can change." Azuka spent an hour talking with her, connecting her with resources, and eventually helping her get a scholarship to attend school while living at one of the Hope Centers. Years later, that same young woman would become a lawyer specializing in child protection, directly inspired by Azuka's kindness to her. This was the ripple effect of choosing kindness over bitterness, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair. 5 years into their marriage, on a quiet evening at home, Azuka and Oluchi sat in their garden watching little Adaeze play. Oluchi leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment settling over them like a warm blanket. "Do you ever regret it?" Azuka asked suddenly. "Marrying me? You could have had anyone." Oluchi sat up and looked at him with mock sternness. "After 5 years, you are still asking me that?" "I just want to be sure," Azuka said with a smile. Oluchi took his face in her hands. "Listen to me carefully, Azuka. I've met wealthy men, educated men, powerful men, men who looked perfect on the surface. But you know what they all lacked? A good heart. A genuinely good heart like yours is rarer than any amount of money or status." She kissed him softly. "I didn't marry you despite your poverty. I married you because of your character. And every single day since then has proven I made the right choice. You're a better partner, a better father, a better person than anyone I could have chosen." Azuka felt the familiar warmth that Oluchi's words always brought. Even now, after years of her reassurance, part of him still marveled at his good fortune. "Besides," Oluchi added with a mischievous grin,
You are the one who made me believe in love. I was so focused on business and revenge before I met you. You taught me that success isn't just about money. It's about who you share your life with and what you do with what you have." As the sun set over their garden, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Azuka reflected on his journey. From orphaned child to abused nephew to freed man to successful philanthropist to husband and father. The path had been painful, but he wouldn't change it, because pain had taught him empathy. Suffering had taught him compassion. Cruelty had taught him the value of kindness. And in the end, the poor orphan boy who was forced to marry a poor girl, who turned out to be a secret billionaire, had discovered something more valuable than any amount of money. He had discovered his own worth, his own strength, his capacity to love and be loved. The village that had witnessed his humiliation had also witnessed his vindication. The family that had abused him had been confronted with their cruelty. But more importantly, Azuka had found peace, not through revenge or bitterness, but through forgiveness and choosing to build something good from his suffering. Years later, when Azuka visited his parents' graves, now beautifully maintained with a small garden around them, he would tell them about his life, about Oluchi, about Adieze, about the centers helping hundreds of children, and he would thank them because somewhere in the love they'd given him in those first 11 years, they had planted seeds of goodness that no amount of subsequent cruelty could completely destroy. "I made it, my ma. I made it, my papa. I survived, and I didn't just survive, I lived. I truly lived." And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The story of the poor boy forced to marry a poor girl, what happened was indeed shocking. Not because of the wealth revealed, though that was dramatic enough, but because it proved something the world often forgets: that kindness survives, that good hearts exist, that suffering doesn't have to destroy you, and that sometimes the people we think are worthless turn out to be priceless. Azuka's legacy wasn't the buildings he helped construct or the businesses he helped manage. His legacy was simpler and more profound. He proved that being treated as worthless doesn't make you worthless. That surviving abuse with your humanity intact is an act of quiet heroism. That choosing forgiveness over bitterness is not weakness, but strength. And for every child who walked through the doors of the Azuka Centers for Hope, for every young person who heard his story and found courage to keep going, for every person who learned that their circumstances don't define their value, for all of them, Azuka's life was a testament to an eternal truth. Your worth is not determined by how others treat you. Your value is inherent, unchangeable, and precious, and no amount of cruelty, poverty, or suffering can take that away, unless you let it. This was the shocking truth that emerged from a forced marriage between two supposedly poor people. That real wealth isn't measured in money, but in character. That true nobility isn't about birth, but about behavior. And that the greatest treasures in life are kindness, forgiveness, love, and the courage to remain good, even when the world has been cruel. Azuka had been forced into a marriage he didn't choose, but from that forced beginning, he had built a life of meaning, purpose, and genuine happiness, not because of luck or fate, but because he had made a choice, the choice to remain kind, to accept love when it was offered, to forgive those who had hurt him, and to use his pain to prevent others from suffering the same way. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.